an imperial guardsman, defending a mad emperor, made a deal with the devil. Will he go down in history as an eternally loyal knight, or as a foolish failure who was unable to accept change? It would be pointless to speculate about this, because neither description applied to this hero, Cain Rator. He would have been happy if he had simply disappeared from the memory of all the people who knew him. The commander of the rebel army, Heilo Reston, could not believe his eyes when he saw the defeated Cain. But it was Cain's own choice, after 29 years of being an orphan. And now, on his deathbed, Cain did not want the young gentleman from the ducal family of Heilo to pick a fight or quarrel with him. Cain could have simply run away, and Heilo did not understand why the young man had made such a choice and decided to simply leave this life. Cain had already breathed his last, and Heilo desperately tried to call out to him, begging him to open his eyes and not leave him. The man could not accept Cain's actions, but now he had no choice. His friend had presented him with a fait accompli. His bare feet touched the surface of the water. It was his first time walking in such a place. Cain was completely naked and could only assume that the space he found himself in was the world of the dead. Perhaps this was what freedom felt like. Still, it wasn't as good as it might have seemed or been described in books. Cain, being in limbo, remembered the last moment. The tears of his dear Heilo, who so desperately wept over his body. Nevertheless, Cain was sure that Heilo would cope without him. Well, now it seemed that the moment had come when Cain could enjoy his freedom. Or not yet. What else would he have to go through in this place? He hadn't been there for more than a few minutes, and when he opened his eyes, he saw an excited Heilo. Or was it not Heilo? The young man called him Karen, saying, "Look how strong and healthy the baby is." The young gentleman's father wanted to hold the baby, even thinking to himself that this baby was very strong and brave because he wasn't even crying. In his dazed state of consciousness, Cain had no idea what was going on or why Heilo looked so old. Everyone in the room was happy about the baby's birth, but Cain's soul seemed to protest. In Heilo's arms, he began to scream and cry, as if the new surroundings and his aging friend frightened him. Cain's crying grew louder and louder, out of incomprehension of what was happening and ignorance of what might happen to him. Cain Rator, the knight who fell alongside the mad emperor 45 years ago, was still mentioned in history. Although he had been unable to keep his master from straying from the right path, he was still considered a symbol of loyalty for staying with his master until the end and not abandoning him. Today's modern history lesson was over, and now the teacher was interested in what the young master thought about it. Karen looked thoughtful and bored at the same time. First of all, he wanted to hear the teacher's opinion. The teacher believed that the Archduke wanted to restore his friend's honor. It was a well-known fact that Archduke Heilo and Sir Cain were very good friends. Karen stood up in protest, as if asking whether this was really the case, whether the teacher believed what he himself was saying. Karen told the teacher that his grandfather did not love his late friend that much, so he deliberately embellished his story. In this story, Cain Rator was the third grandson of Heilo Reston and the only child of Duke Peel. The teacher stood there, puzzled by the young gentleman's words, wondering what kind of nonsense this kid was spouting. Then the young man explained that his grandfather could not come to terms with Cain's decision at the time. Cain chose death instead of joining the rebellion. He did not care that Cain wanted a quiet death rather than the glory of a hero. The young gentleman's words surprised the teacher more and more, because how could anyone want a quiet death when they had died so valiantly? However, there were unofficial records that the duel between the Archduke and Cain the Orator ended too quickly for fighters of their level. And if we assume that Cain chose death so as not to endanger his friend's life in battle, and not to join the rebellion, then this was a quite plausible theory. But the teacher did not understand how a 10-year-old child came to this conclusion. But if the teacher agreed with this bold opinion, the Duke's knights could behead him for blasphemy. Therefore, in order to save his life and not contradict the young gentleman, he had to remain neutral, as if he had never thought about it in such terms. However, Karen did not insist on his theory, and admitted that he was just joking, and did not understand why the teacher was so surprised. Now our hero, still in the early days of Cain Rator, was called Cain Reston. He was born into a ducal family and became the grandson of Duke Reston, his best friend in his past life. It took him some time to figure everything out, but the conclusion was that he was now Heilo's grandson. And remembering his past life, Karen was indignant that this foolish fool dared to make him a hero, the great Cain Rator. Still, Karen really hoped that his best friend would understand his desire without him having to explain. But as it turned out, that wasn't the case. This man was actually Heilo's younger son, Pale, Karen's father. The son approached his father silently, and decided to cough to get his attention. His father was praying again, which Cain often caught him doing, especially lately, because an important event was coming up soon. Cain suspected that his father was very worried about his awakening ceremony. Pale became more serious, although he was a little nervous and apologized to his son. Unlike his brothers, Pale was unable to awaken his magical powers, so he was afraid that he might pass on this inability to his son. Noticing his father's anxiety, Cain decided to reassure him, seeing how he constantly tried to help him. Our hero considered his father to be the best, and no matter what anyone said, it would not change his opinion of him. It seemed that such a grown man was ready to cry at his child's words. Pale had the best son he could have ever dreamed of, and he couldn't help but hug the little boy with all his might. Pale had always been very kind to Cain and never denied him anything. But despite this, Cain did not grow up to be a spoiled child. They had a wonderful relationship, and if Cain had to choose his place of birth again, he would undoubtedly choose to be Pale's child. After dinner with his family, Cain settled down in his room and thought about the awakening ceremony. In fact, he didn't even know what it was or what he was about to face. But in a past life, Heilo had once told Cain that it was a ceremony performed in the Reston family. It could be called an outdated tradition. This ceremony was supposed to teach you how to use magic and unlock your talent for it. Cain assumed that even magic was something you were born with, just like wealth, and decided not to listen to Heilo anymore, because all of this was beyond his reach. But despite Cain saying he didn't care, Heilo continued. Not everyone could awaken magic, and awakening did not automatically make someone the head of the family. Moreover, only the heads of families were told one huge secret. Cain became seriously interested when the conversation turned to the secret. He thought it was something like a legendary treasure or a magic book that granted wishes. Cain was genuinely interested, because with such a thing, he could live peacefully somewhere in the wilderness, where no one knew him. For some reason, Heilo even smiled at his friend's thought, and Cain was annoyed that he was laughing at his dream. It wasn't easy for Cain to reveal his thoughts to anyone. Being an orphan, he trusted few people and found it difficult to open up to others. But Heilo was simple and promised that if he ever became the head of the family, he would tell him this secret. The ritual of awakening magic. The ceremony. All these things were exciting for Cain in this life. But in a moment, our hero realized that neither he nor his father had anything to worry about. This was because Cain had already managed to awaken his magic long ago and would do so without any problems at the ceremony. For the first time in his life, Cain was at the train station and was going to ride a train for the first time. He looked at everything around him with childlike interest. The creation of the train was made possible by technologies sponsored by Cain's father. Whenever his wife began to praise her husband, he always felt embarrassed and modest. He could talk like that all the time, but in reality, he was surely proud of his breakthroughs. However, Cain himself was very proud of his father, and he wasn't lying at all. This man may not have awakened his magical powers, but he was amazing because he single-handedly provided 30% of the duchy's budget. Cain had really hit the jackpot in terms of family, because he always had a kind and gentle mother, as well as a father who was devoted to his family. Cain had no doubt that he had perfect parents. He couldn't have had a better life. The train had already departed, but Cain continued to look with interest at everything he could see from the window. And for the first time in his life, he saw the main estate of the Restons from the outside. It was truly magnificent. It was also called the Fortress of the Azure Sea. Quite a lot of people lived and worked in the fortress, all for the good of the state. As he traveled further and further from his home, Cain thought that somewhere in this Fortress of the Azure Sea was Heilo Reston, his friend from the past, who had finally achieved the status of Duke and probably learned that very secret. Cain was surprised that Heilo had actually left back then, and then went on to turn him into some kind of great historical figure. Cain gave in to his emotions, and his father couldn't ignore the changes in his son's condition, so he watched with interest. To get revenge on his former friend, Cain was ready to do anything to become the biggest headache in Heilo's life. As Cain set off for the most important ceremony of his life, he already knew that he would become the most notorious mad dog of the Reston family. Heilo could only wait, because his dear younger grandson was already on his way to him. A representative of the local castle had already welcomed the third young gentleman upon his arrival. The young family had not been here for quite some time. It had been a whole year since Pale had seen Heinrich. Our hero noticed the knights standing behind Heinrich. They were knights of the Order of Haran. Moreover, it did not escape Cain's attention that these knights had already noticed that he had awakened his mana. They were not at all like the knights in Cain's territory. Cain was already prepared for the fact that very soon, Heilo would also find out about everything, but he didn't care. Heinrich was already ready to escort the main guests into the castle. However, no one lingered at the threshold. The Duke asked Cain to wait there while he greeted the family elders, and if the young gentleman needed anything, he could always call a maid. The fortress of the Azure Sea was truly impressive. Cain was only in the reception room, but it was simply enormous. Our hero soon became bored alone in this huge room, and he already regretted not asking to go to the study. The boy who suddenly entered heard these thoughts and commented sarcastically, saying that he had barely arrived at the estate and already wanted to go to the study. As everyone said, the boy confirmed the rumors that Cain was indeed a good boy. However, everything was logical for him. Since Cain was his uncle's son, he had almost no chance of awakening mana. So he had better study if he wanted to rake in money like his father. Of course, our hero didn't like such comments. He turned black as night and started heading towards the offender. The guy took it as if Cain wanted to fight, and he didn't mind, so he decided to use a little bit of his mana and teach this guy a lesson. It was as if a bully had moved into the house. Cain didn't need to say a word to let the guy know his place. The guy was confused. He didn't understand when Cain had awakened mana, because his father hadn't even mentioned it. However, it was obvious because even our hero's father didn't know anything about it. But there was a more important problem, as Cain saw it. There was no place for two assholes in one family, and Cain wanted to take that role for himself, so he kindly asked him to get lost. The young gentleman did not understand what Cain was talking about, but Cain took it as a refusal, and if he did not want to give up this role, then it was time for a fight. All of the brothers already knew that Cain had indeed awakened the mana. After all, the three captains of the knightly order who were with Heinrich confirmed it. The second son of the House of Reston, Heilo Reston, was not happy that Cain had awakened the mana. But this was not even reported to the main house, so of course he began to suspect that Pale was up to something. What else could Pale say but the truth, since he himself did not know about it? The first son of the Reston family, Heilo Reston, did not want Raphael to make assumptions based on nothing, because Pale did not possess mana, and it was not surprising that he himself had not noticed anything. However, his older brothers did not like Pale very much, and treated him with due respect for appearances, although they themselves did not recognize his power in the family. The awkward silence did not last long. Someone came running to the head butler, asking him to come to the waiting room immediately. The brothers did not stay away because it was about their children. Nervously, the servant explained the situation. Raphael was literally boiling with rage, while Pale tried to smooth things over, thinking it was some kind of misunderstanding. When Raphael entered the room and saw his child beaten, everything probably became clear to him. Cain decided to be polite and introduced himself to Raphael, probably wanting to explain everything. But the man could not contain his anger, and did not understand how this ill-mannered brat could behave in such a way. He grabbed Cain by the scruff of his neck and began to question him, asking what he was thinking when he did something like this. In the end, Cain didn't lose his composure and explained that Leo had insulted his father. He wondered if, had he been in Raphael's place, he would have just stood by and watched his father being insulted. But Raphael didn't want to believe Cain and thought he was lying. Pyle tried to stop it all, while Tylus probably felt uninvolved and just watched from the sidelines. Raphael wouldn't even let Peel get close to his son, and he accused him of not raising him right. In the end, the butler Heinrich asked for all this mess to stop. After all, the Duke said he would make the decision himself. The brothers couldn't disobey. Finally, Raphael let Cain go, and Peel was able to take him away. But Raphael was not happy with this decision. Pale knew his son well and was very concerned about his condition, so he did not even think about scolding him for anything. Henry was going to take all the brothers to the Duke, and Raphael wanted to spit. Our hero was preparing for this meeting with Heilo, and it's hard to imagine what he was thinking about it. They hadn't seen each other for a long time, and Heilo must have changed a lot during that time. Of course, Heilo would never know whose soul was hidden under the guise of Cain. But Cain remembered every moment of his past with his precious friend. First of all, Heilo wanted to know why Cain had caused such a commotion as soon as he arrived at the fortress of the Azure Sea. Pale wanted to answer for his son, but Heilo clearly did not want to hear him. He asked Cain the question anyway. He wanted to hear his grandson's answer. Heilo knew perfectly well that he was not so foolish as to act without thinking about the consequences. Therefore, he was sure that there must have been a reason for his actions. Cain was actually surprised that Heilo was willing to listen to the reason before punishing him. However, over such a long period of time, he had become very generous and was not even like himself anymore. Cain stood by his truth and repeated that Leo had insulted his father. Raphael was angry, saying that Cain was lying again and that he didn't know how to tell the truth. Of course, his father did not like Raphael's behavior. How dare he raise his voice in his presence? Raphael's quick temper often prevented him from controlling himself, even in his father's presence. In that case, Heilo suggested simply finding out everything and calling Leo. Besides, the doctor had already examined his grandson. But that wasn't the only question Heilo wanted to ask Karen. Karen thought that now the conversation would turn to mana, and immediately confessed that he had awakened it 3 years ago. Still, Heilo did not understand why Karen had not even told his own father about this. Heilo was surprised that he had managed to awaken his mana on his own 3 years ago. Karen told everyone that he realized he had awakened his mana only after reading a book. It happened over time. Heilo listened attentively. It was difficult to understand what he was thinking, but Karen had not yet finished his story. However, after he realized that he had mastered mana, he simply wanted to keep it a secret. It seemed to him that having a secret was fun, and what was even more fun was that none of the knights in their lands had noticed anything. However, this was the whole truth, and Heilo tried to think everything through carefully, not even expecting it to be so simple. But finally, young Lord Leo was brought into the office. He was not in the best condition. Karen had really tried hard to bruise his delicate face. Heilo immediately asked his grandson from the doorway if it was true that he had really insulted Peel. Leo didn't even have time to answer before Karen politely interrupted him. Although Leo called his father a loser who only thinks about money and an arrogant good-for-nothing who pretends to be a big shot, Karen believed that he shouldn't have hit him anyway, so Karen admitted and repented, realizing that he had made a big mistake. Leo may not have said so, but he understood what a trap he had fallen into, and could hardly do anything about it. Heilo asked Leo a direct question. Was Karen really not lying about this? Leo, realizing that he might be in danger from Karen, admitted that, in general, he hadn't lied. Heilo was quite calm. Everything was clear to him now. But since the awakening ceremony was tomorrow, he postponed punishment for both grandsons until after it was over. Heilo sent everyone to rest, and remaining alone with Heinrich, he asked his opinion about Peel's son. Heinrich couldn't say anything for sure, but he thought there was a lot about him that might interest Heilo. The boy seemed interesting to them, because he had not only been able to awaken mana on his own 3 years ago, but also to hide it successfully. Moreover, he had probably also questioned the skills of the knights stationed in Peel's lands. It was as if he was hinting that Heilo had completely neglected his son by assigning such incompetent people to him. Heinrich thought that his master was digging too deep, but Heilo hoped for that too. But as for the third grandson, there was something different about him, and Heilo hoped to find out what it was tomorrow. For some reason, he was sure that just awakening mana wasn't everything. There were many questions about him. For example, would he be able to successfully pass tomorrow's ceremony? And if so, what would he get in the end? Heilo was very curious about all this, and spent the whole evening thinking about this boy. Late at night, all the elders of the Reston house gathered. It was Karen's first time in such a setting, and he was on his guard the whole time. He noticed that although everyone was calm, he felt that they were all incredibly powerful. For example, Heilo's first son, Tylus, and his daughter, Chloe. They were the leaders of the family. Raphael and his son Leo also possessed mana, although it was probably not as strong as Tylus's. And since the whole family was gathered here, our hero could conclude that this event was more important than he thought. Finally, our hero could see with his own eyes the Stone of Oath, which stood in a special place. Karen immediately recognized this stone. Even if it had not been in such a prominent place, he would have recognized it among 1,000 stones. It was time to begin the ceremony, so Heilo began the official part, so to speak. Heilo explained the procedure to our hero. When he entered the rift that would open the Stone of Oath, the world that the stone would reveal would await him. It was rumored that this world was unique and different for everyone. The ceremony would end when Karen destroyed that world with the weapon of clarity that he would receive there. In principle, everything was crystal clear, and our hero had no unnecessary questions. Therefore, he had to begin the ritual. Under the influence of the amulet, Heilo managed to activate the Stone of Oath, which emitted an incredibly powerful energy of mana. The portal was already open, and our hero had only seconds left to say something final and get in. Pale, like a loving father, was naturally worried about his son, and asked him if he was really going to be able to handle it. Karen did not seem confused. He was sure that his father had nothing to worry about. Now our hero must destroy this world with the weapons he will receive for breaking it. He was sure that this task was just right for him. He always knew how to smash everything to smithereens. Heilo watched his grandson's every step closely and finally wished him to overcome his fear. Karen had already entered the portal, but he heard this wish. And for some reason, he thought about it. He found himself in the place where his old life had once ended. There were many dead soldiers around him, killed in battle. He walked among these corpses and wondered why he had ended up in this particular place. Why were his memories of this place so vivid? Even his corpse had been preserved. Did someone want him to suffer with guilt as he looked at his fallen comrades in battle? He walked on and finally saw the steps of the main palace, which led him to the throne. His world was cruel and empty, the world of the Blue Wolf's child. A voice began to tell him that the time had come, and now the covenant made with our hero's ancestor had to be fulfilled. Our hero took each step cautiously, as if afraid of scaring away the voice with the sound of his footsteps. The blood that flowed in his veins must not be defiled by some demon, so Charon had to overcome his fear and ascend the throne. After all, what he was looking for was there. All this happened a long time ago. Only a few memories slipped into our hero's mind. Moving further into the hall, he noticed that something was indeed lying on the throne. To think that the emperor wanted to protect the throne so much, that he even sealed it with a demon. And you can't say that he and his companion died because of such nonsense. At that moment, Charon felt as if he were walking over their corpses. The soul of a child, blessed by the cold and deep northern sea, wandered. But despite this, he finally made it here. On behalf of the Blue Clan, our hero was welcomed and given his weapon. Charon immediately remembered his trusty blade, a gift from the emperor. The demonic sword of ruin. A voice urged our hero to pour his mana into it. But the boy did not understand why, because it was a demonic sword that devoured the soul of its owner. The demonic will that dwelled within it had already been destroyed by his grandfather. And what Charon saw now was only a distorted illusion. The voice continued to urge the young man to awaken his blade, for only he was capable of doing so. Charon still doubted whether he could even touch it, lest he become what he once was, someone who killed on the emperor's orders. But the words and image of the young Heilo, who told him to overcome his fear, came back to Charon's mind. Charon noticed that, surprisingly, Heilo was acting really friendly. The true purpose of the awakening ceremony was not simply to obtain a weapon. It was designed to help the clan heir who had awakened the magic of clarity overcome the source of his fear. In that case, our hero no longer had any doubts and touched the hilt of the demonic sword. He couldn't leave here empty-handed, so he filled his long-lost sword with his mana. After he did so, he felt the magic of clarity upon himself, and he no longer had any doubts that something was wrong. Right before the guy's eyes, the appearance of his sword began to transform, as if shedding its skin. The voice did not know why the blade appeared before Charon in this form, but it was originally the sword of the founder of his clan. The blade that Corona's grandfather had taken was also the founder's sword. But unlike the one Corona had, this blade was not mentioned in the chronicles. This was because the power it possessed was completely different from that of the Corona clan. The power that our hero was literally bathed in was incredibly powerful, and he gritted his teeth as he held the sword, which seemed as if it might disappear at any moment. But after a few minutes, the power subsided. The voice told Charon to be patient. The magic that lived in the blade was imprinted on his body. Our hero noticed that the flow of mana in his body had become even stronger. Just think, the magic of the blade could have such a huge effect. Charon was convinced that the magic of clarity and truth was special. Only he did not understand what the true name of this blade was. A blade that had beheaded countless demons and absorbed their power. A blade that even demons feared, eventually forgetting of its existence. A blade born in the depths of the northern sea, both dark and pure at the same time. A blade of execution, a guillotine. That was the true name of this blade. The mere mention of this blade made demons fear, and those who possessed it feel confident in their powers. Charon admired every pattern on this blade, and could not believe that the blade of execution, the guillotine, had fallen to him. This blade was like the deep sea, like darkness itself. And now it was a match for our hero's destiny. Charon finally wanted to know who this voice belonged to. The voice called itself one of the Blue Clan. Could it be that he was a blue dragon, guardian of the Reston clan? But the voice insisted that Charon did not yet have the strength to bear his true name. When the day came and the boy could control his power, control the seas, then he would be able to find him in the northern sea. Realizing that he would not get an answer, Charon decided to think about how to get out of there. Although the voice claimed that Charon already knew this. Charon was quick-witted and quickly figured out what was going on. However, he had long wanted to try something like this at least once in his life. Everyone was exhausted from waiting, especially Pale, who was very worried about his son. It was very obvious, so Heilo decided to calm his son down so that he wouldn't worry so much. Heilo assumed that it must be painful for a father to watch his own son follow a path that he himself had never been able to take. The father knew that it was not easy. Nevertheless, he believed that it was precisely at moments like these that one had to be strong and hold on. Suddenly, Leo noticed that the oath stone was about to crack. The stone was literally crumbling before everyone's eyes. This wasn't the first time Heilo had performed such a ritual, so he knew that this shouldn't be happening. But in another moment, sparks of mana literally flew out of the oath stone and scattered everywhere. Heilo, being the most experienced here, had no idea what was going on. Cain finally managed to get out of that place and couldn't believe his eyes that he had actually done it. Already back with his family, our hero suddenly discovered that the oath stone was cracked. Pale was terrified for his son, and for the consequences they would have to face because of the broken oath stone. Cain himself did not expect that he would somehow break this stone, which had stood there for centuries. It was a pure misunderstanding. Heilo did not look very pleased. He was probably angry, but nevertheless had not yet said anything about it. He probably wasn't thinking about the stone at all. Heil immediately recognized the blade in Karen's hands as the guillotine blade, the executioner's sword, or the blade used to execute their ancestor, Heilo Reston. The Duke wondered why the sword, known only to the head of the family and the elders, who had even erased it from the family history, had appeared only now. Heilo could only guess what it meant, what its appearance now foreshadowed. Heilo remembered a forgotten covenant and wondered if the time of that covenant was really so close. His grandfather decided to ask his grandson one question. Was he afraid of this sword? Cain answered confidently without hesitation that the sword did not frighten him at all, which actually surprised Heilo. But he was pleased and said nothing more, as if he had plunged back into his thoughts. Long ago, the ancestors had failed to fulfill the covenant with the blue dragons and destroy the demons that came from the edge of the world. They left a stone of oath as a symbol of this covenant for the future. They left not just a stone, but also hope. Hope that one of their descendants would fulfill it. Heilo came to the conclusion that Cain was the one destined to do so. The Duke had no choice but to accept this fact. Realizing the situation, Heilo Reston gave a speech. Heilo Reston declared Cain, son of Heilo Reston, a full member of the Fortress of the Azure Sea and a direct descendant, chosen by the blade of the guillotine, with the right to inherit the spirit of the sea. Raphael was outraged, and he couldn't even hide his indignation. Just think. A youngster would inherit the style of the spirit of the sea. But it seemed that Peel was more concerned about his son's condition, whether he was injured and how he was feeling. The only one who did not show his emotions was Tylus. The man thought he knew all the weapons that had been passed down in their family from generation to generation, but he had never even heard of this blade. In addition, the aura of the guillotine execution sword was so frightening that it was even scary to look at it. Tyles was well aware that Peel's son was now walking a path that he himself had never been able to tread. But Tyles couldn't allow the family inheritance to depend on such an unpredictable variable as Peel's son. Since the ceremony was over and the sun was rising outside, the Duke decided to return home. Everyone followed Heilo, except for Raphael, who stood there confused. He was outraged. Was his brother Tylos really going to stand there and watch all this happen? Tyles was not so impulsive, and he briefly told his brother that they would soon have a private conversation. Raphael was surprised. Could it be that this guy, whose ambitions always outstripped his abilities, felt threatened by the youngster? Of course, Raphael was also interested in whether Tylos knew about the guillotine blade, but no one knew about it except for Heilo himself. Raphael couldn't calm down. One thought tormented him, and he couldn't understand why it was the son of Peel. Tylos probably shared Raphael's thoughts, but he wasn't as expressive as his younger brother. And yet it was because now was not the time to quarrel. Tylos knew perfectly well that contradicting his father was not the best decision. After the break, Pale stood at the station with his wife and son. The father was concerned about whether his son would be able to cope here on his own. Henry intervened in the conversation, wondering if there was a safer place than the Fortress of the Azure Sea. Pale had to agree, because the Fortress of the Azure Sea was indeed a very well-guarded place. And Pale was not bothered by external threats at all. He saw right through his older brothers and knew that his son needed to be careful about internal threats. But on the other hand, as long as his father was around, Pale counted on his brothers not to act rashly. But there were still some things that Heinrich had to tell the third young gentleman before his departure. Namely, Lady Sabina had been appointed responsible for passing on the ceremonial legacy of the guillotine to Caron. It was clear how much this reassured his father. However, Pale did not hide this, and Cain tried to remember who Lady Sabina was. Sabina Reston was the younger sister of the Heilo, a woman whose skill, they say, is second to none. She was even given the nickname White Wolf, as far as our hero could remember. This was an attempt to describe her fighting skills. Sabina had always been kind to Pale, so his father instructed his son not to be rude to her. Before Peel left for home, Heinrich remembered that he had another message from the head of the house. Heilo ordered that a residence be prepared for Peel in the fortress of the Azure Sea so that he could come at any time. This news deeply moved Peel. He probably never expected anything like this. His father's kindness meant a lot to him. And yet, thanks to this, Pale was able to go home with peace of mind. Finally, his father said goodbye to his son, asked him to take care of himself, and told him that if he needed help, he could turn to him at any time. Karen's parents had already left, and he and Heinrich climbed the high stairs and looked at the scenery around them. Time was of the essence, and they were on their way to Lady Sabine. However, our hero himself did not want to keep his grandmother waiting. Henry stopped for a moment and asked permission to give the young gentleman some advice. Of course, Karen had no objection. However, the advice was that Lady Sabine did not like being called a grandmother, including a cousin or any other kind. Charon promised to take this advice into account and thanked him for it. But in his heart, he did not even understand why she could not be called grandmother. Everyone knew that only direct descendants of the family could enter the Hall of Ancestors of the Fortress of the Azure Sea. And now, Lady Sabina was waiting for our hero. Before Karen left, Heinrich suddenly remembered to warn our hero that Leo was also here. Our hero couldn't help but be delighted by this news. Moreover, the second young gentleman had specifically asked Lady Sabina about it. Lady Sabina was probably already waiting there, so Karen ran as fast as he could. And Heinrich thought about how it hadn't been this noisy here in a long time. Being close to the door, our hero noticed a huge magical energy. However, even outside, it was no less noticeable. Karen seemed to be trying to collect his thoughts and was still standing on the threshold. But Lady Sabina seemed to sense him and shouted at him to come in. Cain Reston introduced himself to Lady Sabina and greeted her as a white wolf. Upon entering and seeing Lady Sabina herself, our hero was very surprised by what he saw. Such a reaction, of course, did not escape Lady Sabina's attention. She was always attentive to even the slightest changes in a person. However, she quickly realized that Karen clearly did not imagine her to be like this. She kept looking at the boy, and couldn't even comprehend that this cute son of Peel had already been her guest. Time flew by mercilessly. Karen stood rooted to the spot, wondering if Lady Sabina had managed to restore her body with magic. If so, it was simply incredible. She must have reached the 8-star level. Karen stood rooted to the spot for several minutes, and Lady Sabina had already thought that this guy wanted to pretend to be a statue. Finally, she suggested that he sit down and cross his legs. However, he could sit next to his brother Leo, who was already showing how happy he was to see his brother Karen. Now these guys would see each other often, so our hero was counting on his older brother Leo. Lady Sabina admitted that she did not even expect to hear her nickname from such a young talent. Karen admitted that he simply loved history and had read about the she-wolf in a book. Actually, as Sabina's older brother had said, he was a really interesting kid, which the girl could see. Karen decided not to miss the moment and asked Lady Sabina what else her grandfather had said about him. Lady Sabina recalled her last conversation with Heilo, who told her that she would like this boy. And now, when Lady Sabina saw him, she understood why. Heilo understood perfectly well what awaited Karen. In the future, he would have to cross a vast, boundless sea. Now this child needed help so that he could later rule the ocean. Heilo instructed his sister, for she was to become a beacon for Karen. Lady Sabina saw this boy for only a moment, but she already understood that his potential was enormous, wild, and boundless, just like the endless ocean itself. It could not be tamed, only adapted to. And now Karen is just as rough and untamed as a wave. But Lady Sabina saw that he had hidden powers that would one day enable him to rule all the seas. Lady Sabina could not even imagine that one day she would meet such an interesting child. She felt that soon she would have fun. However, she didn't want to delay it for long and decided to start training right away. The cross-legged position in which the children were now sitting was the basis for developing magic. Once they mastered the basics, they would be able to develop magic even without it. For example, as Lady Sabina was demonstrating now. She didn't need any special posture because she could manifest her magic, her mana, in any state. Such energy impressed everyone. Karen was sure that this was the very essence of magic and clarity. The style of the spirit of the sea is essentially the art of controlling the sea itself. It is the art of creating and controlling the seas within one's own body, with the help of magic and clarity. Naturally, the more seas you controlled, the stronger you were. If you could control 8, you would become an 8-star. The The state of controlling 8 seas as one is called 9-star. Only 3 people on the continent possessed such power. And in the entire empire, only 1 person had reached this level. And of course, it was Karen's grandfather, Heilo. The only 9-star master on the continent, Heilo Reston. Realizing the power his former friend possessed, Karen was confident that in this life he would surely surpass him. Lady Sabina didn't even need to say a word to see the thirst for power in Karen's eyes. In fact, as her older brother said, he was an interesting fellow. Lady Sabina had no doubt that training him would be a pleasure. And from that moment on, our hero's lessons began. The first lesson was devoted to how to channel his magic so that it would open during the awakening ceremony. And the main rule that our hero remembered was that the power of the sea did not need to be controlled. It needed to be accepted. He felt these waves raging inside him, and it was impossible to tame them. In fact, he had to obey Lady Sabina's advice. It was difficult for Karen to do something like this, but nevertheless, he tried to let these waves into himself, to allow himself to feel them. Meanwhile, Lady Sabina watched Karen closely, and wondered if this was really the magic of a boy who had just awakened. Even Leo, who had been studying for 2 years, had only managed to reach 2 stars. But Karen was already laying magical channels himself, even though Lady Sabina had not even taught him how to do it. One could guess that the pain was tearing his body apart, but he endured it patiently. Suddenly, Lady Sabina noticed that he had interrupted his active meditation. Had he reached the limits of his body? Lady Sabina also noticed that he could control his pace and did not show any emotions. But her attention quickly shifted to Leo, who had completely fainted and could no longer do anything. Lady Sabina had told them earlier not to use magic thoughtlessly, but Leo had apparently decided to ignore this advice. Sabina herself noticed that she was so focused on the Karen that she completely forgot about Leo. Even though these two had awakened their magic, they were still just children. That's why someone like Lady Sabina was needed here, to make sure the boys didn't hurt themselves. Lady Sabina noticed that Karen had already come to his senses, and apparently had definitely reached his limit and stopped himself so as not to overload his body. At such a young age, despite his strong thirst for power, Karen managed to keep his cool and think clearly, which was worthy of respect. Moreover, Lady Sabina concluded that this child would not need any guidance. Leo had already come to his senses, and Lady Sabina quickly forgot about him. She had more questions for Karen. Lady Sabina promised that she would guarantee Karen's safety for 3 years, which she had actually promised to him himself. But all this time, Karen had to spend on becoming strong enough to defend himself, as Lady Sabina had asked him to do. In fact, this was the place where he could train his self-defense, sword skills, and physical endurance. Leo was surprised by Karen's choice, that he really wanted to train with his sword. Karen didn't understand what the big deal was. After all, his grandfather had given him a special scabbard to dampen his aura, and Leo was apparently still ready to wet his pants, even though he denied it in every way possible. Karen and Leo had already met the commander of the knights, who greeted the young gentleman. Starting today, he would teach young Lord Karen how to fence. The commander of the knights, Hiran, Zeras Zimnastraj, was happy to introduce himself to the young men and allowed them to call him Sir Zeras. Our hero needed only one glance to realize that he was in the presence of an 8-star master. It was obvious to him. It might have been rude, but Sir Zeras warned that he would not address Karen as the Duke's grandson. After all, he would first have to earn the recognition of the Knights of Hiran, the Blue Wolves. Karen was satisfied with everything, but Sir Zeras did not need to worry. It was even better for him, as he was not accustomed to the title of the Duke's grandson. Karen knew perfectly well that the respect of the Blue Wolves had to be earned through skill, for such were the customs of the House of Reston. Sir Zeras was surprised, for anyone in Karen's place would have already begun to assert their rights. Moreover, he was sure that Leo would be no exception in this case. Sir Zeras was very happy that the Reston family finally had an heir with a good head on his shoulders. But our hero considered all this unimportant, because in the end, everyone would bow their heads before him. After these words, Sir Zeras realized that he was wrong, because it seemed that a wild beast had appeared in this family. And this wild beast was probably worse than the unbearable Leo. 3 years have passed, but we are still in the fortress of the Azure Sea. Sabina never stopped praising her brother's wine because it was the best. And Heilo, out of habit, kept telling Sabina that it was time for her to stop carrying his drinks around. Lady Sabina did not understand how her brother could be so rude. She had been taking care of his grandchildren for 3 whole years, simply because he had asked her to. Of course, Heilo didn't mind the drinks, but he couldn't believe that 3 whole years had already passed. Of course, the Duke wanted to know what Lady Sabina thought of Karen after all this time. Lady Sabina could describe him in one word. This boy was a monster to her. Heilo noticed that his sister liked to call him that. Moreover, she believed that calling him a genius was an insult. Of course, the Duke did not forget to ask for Xeris's opinion, who had also spent a lot of time with Karen. As the leader of the Knights, Xeris had been watching Karen for the past 3 years, and therefore agreed wholeheartedly with Lady Sabina. His physical abilities, innate talent, attitude toward training, determination, and courage. He was exceptional in everything. Moreover, Karen seemed to him to be even more gifted than the first young master, whom everyone considered a genius. Xeris was referring to Tiles's firstborn, Hugo. Heilo remembered this comparison. It was surprising that someone more talented than Hugo, whom everyone considered the best in the entire empire, had appeared. Lady Sabina was of the opinion that if her brother did not deal with this, he would have problems in his family. Heilo had to think about how Karen could affect the order of succession, and what his appearance would mean for Heilo's sons. Lady Sabina assumed that her uncles could well harm her nephew. Everything was still under strict control, but what would happen when rumors spread throughout the empire? It was obvious to Lady Sabina how this could affect the succession to the title of Duke of Heilo and everything else. And Heilo should not have pretended that he had no idea about it. Especially now that the Stone of Oath had been destroyed, Sabina wondered if their family was doomed. And the sea monsters from the north that had crossed the border had also become much more active. For Sabina, all this was obvious, especially such manifestations. But Heilo had a different opinion and considered it all nonsense. He was sure that whoever destroyed the Oathstone would establish a new one, just as their ancestor had done many years ago. Lady Sabina had actually heard for the first time in her life that the duties of the head were passed down by inheritance. And that meant that the time of the covenant was near. Sabina anticipated that their youngest would have to shoulder a heavy burden. The only question that remained was when Heilo would tell Karen about his responsibilities. But Heilo was just waiting for the right moment. A letter arrived at the Peel Palace from his son. "Dad, is everything okay with you? Sorry I haven't visited. Training has taken up all my time. It's gotten very cold lately, and you're sensitive to the cold, so dress warmly. I recently achieved 4 stars in the Sea Spirit style, and also mastered the 4th form of Blue Wolf fencing. I'm trying to get along with my relatives as you asked, especially with my brother Leo. I'm taking good care of him. By the way, Dad, I have a request for you. I've run out of pocket money, so could you send me some more?" At that moment, Pale even smiled and thought, what a spendthrift. Pale shared his thoughts with Heinrich, because he still remembers how worried he was when he left his son in the fortress of the Azure Sea 3 years ago, and now the father was very happy that his son had settled in so well there. Heinrich believed that thanks to his younger grandson, peace reigned in the fortress of the Azure Sea. And yet Pale had told Karen so many times that standing out was not a good thing. But Heinrich believed that a precious stone cannot shine even if it remains in place. And that was a true thought concerning the Karen. Heinrich assumed that everything could change very soon. After all, it was likely that Heilo would no longer be able to conceal information about Karen. Pale guessed that his son might soon be given an assignment. However, Heinrich said the same thing. Karen must carry out any orders given to him as a Blue Wolf. Pale knew this, but he was concerned about something else. His 2 older brothers would not be pleased with Karen's growing influence in the fortress of the Azure Sea. There could be many opinions on this matter, but Heinrich could only say one thing. Lady Sabina took very good care of Karen, and yes, that certainly greatly reduced her anxiety about her son. Karen had been writing about this to his father in letters for the past 3 years, but hearing it from Henry was much more reassuring, especially since Lady Sabina had always taken care of Pale as well. However, Peel thought that sending her money every month had also helped. Peel joked, and Heinrich thought that he had become a little calmer. But there was another thought that bothered Pyle, because as far as he remembered, Aunt Sabina was going to leave the fortress of the Azure Sea soon. But Heinrich believed that there was no need to worry about this, and yet the young gentleman still had questions about it. Heinrich knew that Karen had already established strong ties with the Order of Ha-Ren of the Azure Sea Fortress. It even got to the point where the knights gave him a nickname, albeit a rather disrespectful one. Of course, this was nothing new to the young lord. Even he had heard these rumors. His son was called the young mad dog of the Azure Sea Fortress, or the psycho dog. Meanwhile, training was in full swing at the Azure Sea Fortress. Our hero didn't even have time to rest. Hans was already giving up, just so that Karen would stop. Karen did not understand why Hans let him pass so easily. The art of the Blue Wolf's sword meant being less restrained than his opponent. Hans had to respond with force, even if something broke in the process, such as a sword or an arm. Hans was a man, and Karen didn't understand why he was such a weakling. But in Hans's opinion, only Karen considered him a weakling, because he had muscles like balloons. In fact, Hans had never even heard such a thing, and Karen was not shy about telling the truth. No one else would tell him such a truth. In any case, without magic, Hans couldn't keep up with Karen, although last year wasn't so bad. Suddenly, Hans let slip that Karen might be sent on a mission very soon. Hans didn't know much, but he knew that Zerath would decide who to send on the mission while the head of the family was in the capital. Most likely it would be the granaries in the western part of the duchy, where monsters had been frequenting lately. Of course, Leo, who was standing nearby, was interested in this, but he thought that he would not want to go on any mission with Karen. And besides, he had training now and needed to concentrate. Although he continued his training, he also continued to think about the mission. He assumed that if he completed it successfully, his mother and father would probably be happy. However, the conversation between Pale and Heinrich was not over yet. Pale had not called Heinrich because of Karen's letter. He had another question. Pale asked Heinrich to look at a small bag. The young gentleman said that the inspector of his estate had found it in a merchant's cart from the barony of Bellis. He put his fingers in the bag, and his white gloves turned a pungent green color. Heinrich was surprised by this discovery. However, the young gentleman already knew that it was cocaine, a psychostimulant. Therefore, he wanted Heinrich to conduct an investigation in Bellis, operating from the fortress of the Azure Sea. As soon as the sun set, Karen decided to act according to his plan and hid behind the wall, waiting for the right moment to escape. Standing behind the wall, he thought about how pleasant it was to rummage through Xerxes' collection. Even though our hero was involved in children's affairs, that didn't mean he had forgotten the taste of good wine. Karen descended the stairs carefree, and did not even notice familiar faces passing by very close to him. The Duke had already left for the capital for an audience with the ruler. In his absence, the commander of the knights was in charge. And this was very untimely, because someone had urgent business with the Duke. Karen drew attention to himself. He was curious as to what they were doing here so late. Before him stood Lord Rohan, the youngest son of Baron Bellis, who claimed to have urgent business at the fortress of the Azure Sea. Lord Rohan immediately recognized his youngest grandson, which meant he was the son of the third Duke, who had been removed from the line of succession. He also heard that Karen had awakened his magic and was now training in the main house, and even remembered his name. Upon Lord Rohan's arrival, they were about to report to the commander of the knights, but Karen decided to take it upon himself to listen to the Lord. Rohan Bellis had a strange reaction, because surely no one present was bothered by a child with a bottle of wine. Karen knew that usually a representative was sent to request a visit, but since the Lord had come in person, the matter was probably urgent. This meant that a nobleman had to respond. All this was true, so Karen decided to take Lord Rohan upon himself for a while, and the footman decided to report the visit to Lord Xerxes. Lord Rohan already believed that this boy was a difficult and spoiled aristocrat, because he had thought the same way at his age. And yet, the bottle in his hand made the Lord very nervous. He kept wondering if the entire Reston family was like that, and if they were allowed to drink before coming of age. And so, at the end of the conversation, the problem was the bandits who had taken over the eastern mountains of the Bellis barony. With their arrival, psychostimulants began to spread, and residents were kidnapped and sold into slavery. The Lord was ashamed to admit it, but the barony of Bellis was poor, with harsh lands and no valuable resources. Moreover, they had not had a proper army for a year, so they could not fight back. Lord Rohan's father could not stand it and attacked the bandits with the few forces they had, but they suffered heavy losses. Lord Rohan's father was wounded and was now bedridden. Rohan felt guilty because his incompetence had caused his father and his people to suffer. Karen listened attentively to Lord Rohan's story and slammed down an unopened bottle of wine, as if he were about to draw a conclusion. Karen believed that such bastards should simply be torn to pieces without mercy, and yet, something didn't add up for him. Karen couldn't understand how the bandits had managed to resist the regular army. Lord Rohan wasn't sure, but he suspected they were deserters from the Southern War. After that, everything became clear to Karen. The Empire's attention was focused on the south because of the battles in that region. The east was left unprotected, so the bandits ran wild. Deserters who became bandits. It all sounded very plausible. Karen couldn't even find anything to complain about. He noticed that Lord Rohan was certainly not in the best mood about this, so he offered his guest some wine. Karen did not know if Lord Rohan was aware of this, but the barony of Bellis bordered his father's lands. So for this reason, our hero could not remain on the sidelines. And if possible, he would even like to help personally. Lord Rohan was grateful for these words, but wondered if it was really possible for him to drink with this kid. Cain decided to mention that he had stolen this wine from Lord Xeris's collection, so he hoped that this would remain between them, and now they could address each other informally. The mention of Lord Xeris's name excited Lord Rohan. He wondered if the commander of the Blue Wolves was here. Suddenly, Lord Xeris himself entered at that moment and immediately addressed Cain, hoping that they had agreed that he would no longer touch his wine. But of course, it was the guest who apologized, because he didn't want to offend Lord Xeris, but the latter was not angry with him at all, because he didn't know about it. Xeris knew that the robbers had caused the barony of Bellis a lot of trouble. In fact, that was why the Lord had come here to ask the Knights of Haran to intervene in the matter. For a moment, Lord Xeris digressed from the topic and reminded Cain that he needed to drink milk, not wine. And then he simply took the glass away from him. He then apologized to Lord Rohan for the impudent behavior of his servant, although the Lord had no issue with it. In any case, Lord Rohan had come to the right place. The fortress of the Azure Sea would not abandon its old allies in their hour of need. Lord Xeris had already told him that they were preparing a detachment to send to the barony of Bellis, so the Lord had nothing to worry about. He would be able to bring good news to his people. Cain, of course, did not stand aside, and he wanted to go with those knights. But Lord Xeris was against it, because those robbers had gone through a war, even though they had escaped. No one knew what masters might be among them. Lord Rohan was surprised that this boy actually wanted to go into battle. Although he had trained in the main house, he looked to be only 12 or 13 years old. Although Cain had already reached the 4th star and mastered the 4th form of the Blue Wolf style in just 3 years, Lord Xeris acknowledged that he was a fine young man. But real combat was something else entirely. Nevertheless, Cain had a different opinion. He believed that excessive protection would not help. Xeris would have preferred to send Cain to the west to face a known threat. But he couldn't allow him to risk facing an enemy whose strength, numbers, and location were unknown. Cain understood this perfectly well, but he thought that if he made Xeris an offer, he couldn't refuse. The next morning, Leo was already dressed in his gear and with a doomed look on his face, kept wondering why him. Lord Rohan felt a little guilty about what was happening, but Cain was happier than ever and encouraged his brother, because in his opinion, their first assignment was great. Xeris stood and saw the boys off, realizing that this little guy had fooled him like a first grader. He just mentioned Lady Sabina, and that's how it all started. Lady Sabina was also already there, watching these cute kids. Xeris just hoped that this was even better, and that they would probably have a reliable protector. Lady Sabina stood on the platform and remembered how nervous she had been before her first assignment. Xeris began to think logically, because if Leo was here too, it meant that Lady Sabina was pleased with their progress in training. Lady Sabina was a legendary white wolf, and her valiant deeds were known everywhere. But was it right to send 2 children on such a dangerous mission? If anything happened to the Duke's grandchildren, the whole family would be responsible. Xeris seemed to sense Lord Rohan's thoughts, and decided to reassure him that everything would be fine, because he was also worried about these children. Xeris was sure that as long as Lady Sabina was with the young heirs, nothing would happen to them. Lady Sabina decided to mention that as long as the little ones were not on the verge of death, she would not interfere. But this did not make the Lord feel any better. Xeris understood perfectly well that Lady Sabina believed in their power and all that. But still, Xeris also had to understand that it wasn't just about that. Lady Sabina had another reason why she simply could not intervene directly. And yet Xeris was aware of this, and since it was Lady Sabina's will, he couldn't persuade her to do otherwise. The train was about to depart, which meant it was time for our hero to say goodbye to Xeris. Leo was shaking with fear before boarding, and if he had had the opportunity to walk away from this task, he would have gladly done so. Lady Sabina could see how nervous Leo was, and explained to him that it was perfectly normal. Still, she tried to help him see the other side of things. After all, this trip was an opportunity to prove how hard he had worked over the past 3 years. And if everything went well, he would have a great chance to gain recognition, become an ally, and join the Blue Wolves. Of course, Leo was very attracted to this opportunity. Cain kept wondering if his brother Leo always needed someone to give him a kick of motivation. Although the boys disliked each other, they tried not to quarrel, especially since they had to work as a team. However, Leo always knew that the day would come when he would have to prove himself. He just didn't think it would happen so soon. The magic train from the Azure Sea Fortress to the barony of Bellis had already departed. What awaited our hero there? On the way, our hero learned that Lady Sabina's very presence in the fortress of the Azure Sea was a secret, so she couldn't reveal herself. If the robbers found out she was there, they would immediately disappear without a trace. And of course, no one wanted that, because once the robbers left, they might return. Still, Lord Rohan was very worried about whether the children would be able to cope without adult support. Of course, he noticed how worried Leo was. Was it really the fact that this was his first assignment that affected him so much? Leo looked very sad, and it was clear that something else was troubling him. Leo was lost in thought, remembering a recent conversation. His mother had criticized him and wondered if he had any sense at all. The woman couldn't understand how her son could just hang out with that boy, Karen. Had he forgotten what happened 3 years ago? His mother was categorically against Leo being friends with Karen. She made him see Karen as a rival, especially after he disgraced his father. How dare Leo be friends with him, laugh and fool around? All this time, Leo listened silently to his mother, and in the end, she wanted to hear something from him. If he had a mouth, of course. She considered her son a future man, but without a shred of courage. Leo plucked up his courage and finally told his mother that he wasn't competing with Karen. It took a lot of effort, but he said it. Everyone knew that Hugo, who was considered a genius, had achieved 3 stars at the age of 14, and Karen at 13. Leo admitted that he had only achieved 3 stars at the age of 15. Therefore, Leo considered Karen to be his role model, someone who could teach him something, and it was obvious that they simply could not compete. But his mother stood her ground, demanding that Leo put such thoughts out of his mind. She believed it was just an inferiority complex. But Leo denied everything, because Karen's very existence pushed him forward, as he boldly declared to his mother. The woman, realizing that it was pointless to try to convince her son of anything or prove anything to him, sighed heavily. It seemed to her that Leo could see the trees but not the forest. Leo was well aware of what he was saying and to whom. He wanted to defend his truth even at the cost of being ridiculed and condemned by his mother. In the end, Lady Sabina pulled him out of the whirlpool of these memories. Leo was worrying her, because he had been out of sorts lately, especially before this trip. Leo, however, did not hide the fact that he was tormented by thoughts. And Lady Sabina was understanding about it, because after all, this was Leo's first assignment. For some reason, only now did she decide to ask the young man if he could kill a person. For example, Karen seemed like the type who would sell Leo out to save his own skin, and Leo thought too much. So Lady Sabina urged the young man not to doubt himself, because she knew that Leo had worked harder than anyone else for the past 3 years. After all, he must not forget who had trained him. Leo fondly remembered their training sessions with Lady Sabina, and even called her master, which she liked. The train was due to arrive at Baron Bellis's estate in 20 minutes. Lady Sabina stood up and suggested that her students call each other master and apprentice for the duration of this assignment. The train was still moving, but if the White Wolf appeared at the station, rumors would spread instantly, and she wanted to act preemptively. Before jumping out the window, Lady Sabina addressed the young baron, because from now on he could call her simply Lady Sabina, and not the White Wolf as he had called her before. Lady Sabina warned that she would look after her grandnephews, so Lord Rohan was not responsible for them. Lady Sabina jumped straight out of the moving train. The men were shocked, and for some reason, our hero found it amusing. Being a grown man, Lord Rohan was no less surprised by Lady Sabina's actions than Leo, who only needed to learn about this life. Pretty soon, our heroes got to the Baron's estate and met Lord Rohan's dad. The Baron was ill, so he hoped that the young wolves of the House of Reston would understand why he was greeting them while seated, and would not judge him. The Baron's crisis had passed. He did not know if the Duke's grandson remembered, but the Baron had met him and his father here 10 years ago. Karen had matured greatly before the Baron's eyes, and he was convinced that Lord Pale was proud of his son. Karen, unaccustomed to all this etiquette, was even a little embarrassed. Therefore, deciding to abandon all formality, Karen suggested that they simply address each other by name, as it was much easier that way. Baron Bellis guessed that if Karen had been sent on his first assignment, it meant he had already achieved his 4th star at such a young age. Of course, Karen did not forget to mention that his brother Leo was still on his 3rd. In any case, it was obvious that if the main house had sent them here, it meant they considered them capable. But as for Baron Bellis, he did not dare to entrust such a dangerous task to 2 promising young men. Karen understood the Baron's concerns, but if they failed to complete this task, it could cast a shadow on the Blue Wolves, and they would lose before they even began. Leo stood there the whole time and didn't say a word, so Cain decided to try to get some support from him, even if it was just to agree with him. The Baron was probably expecting these words. He wanted to understand whether the boys were truly ready or had been sent here against their will. The Baron needed rest, but before they left, he told the boys that he was counting on them. Moreover, Baron Bellis had already arranged for a guide so the boys could follow him. Leo was walking behind everyone else, and Cain decided to ask if he was already tired. Leo shared his thoughts in a low voice. He wasn't tired, but the guy who was leading them was a herbalist, and Leo had doubts about whether he could be trusted. Even if he knew the mountain trails and had been appointed by the young Baron, there was no guarantee that he wasn't in cahoots with the bandits. Cain was glad that his younger brother was finally starting to think for himself. Cain confirmed Leo's thoughts. He also believed that this guide was most likely a member of the gang that was terrorizing the locals. Of course, Leo was interested in how Cain had come to this conclusion. Cain did not hide his methods, and admitted that he had exchanged a few words with Lord Rohan when they first arrived at the station. When they were alone, Cain immediately asked Lord Rohan how they could find these bandits. And then the young Baron immediately revealed his idea that they had no choice but to use the traitors themselves. Actually, it was obvious, and it was the only good option. But Leo didn't understand why Cain hadn't told him about it right away. However, there was at least one reason. Leo had been on edge all day. Was there any point in telling him about it? To plant a traitor, knowing full well who he was, Leo thought Lord Rohan was very perceptive. Keeping a rat close by and allowing it to act was risky. And the fact that they still hadn't figured it out only proved it. It also meant that he was in complete despair. That's why Cain and Leo were now bait. Two young aristocrats traveling through the barony to neighboring lands. They could be captured, and a hefty ransom demanded. So Cain was counting on them to take the bait any minute now. However, they finally arrived and met the very robbers to whom the traitor of the barony had led them. The leader of the gang thanked the Swan for his work, and since these kids were rich, he threw some money at him. Of course, the bandits noticed that these kids weren't going to give up without a fight. Cain, of course, did not even think about surrendering, because he had been preparing for so long to finally prove himself in his first assignment. And now he was wondering who would be the first to have their hand cut off for trading psychotropic drugs. Meanwhile, in Baron Bellis's domain, Lord Rohan was worried about his father, who was still not in the best condition. Baron Bellis was indeed in a bad way, but nevertheless, despite this, he tried to hold on so as not to let his people down. Rohan tried to help his father in everything, but now he was also worried about the boys, because they were very young and inexperienced. Although the Baron thought that if the Fortress of the Azure Sea had sent 2 teenagers to their lands without having accurate information about the robbers, they must have been confident in the abilities of these young people. Moreover, Cain reminded Baron Bellos very much of Duke Heilo in his youth, and it was not only in appearance, but also in their manner of carrying themselves, their calm and carefree disposition. They were remarkably similar. For these reasons, Baron Bellos believed that they could safely rely on these young men. Returning to Cain and Leo, the guys had already dealt with many soldiers. Or rather, Cain had. For some reason, Leo stood aside during the entire battle, and did not even think of joining Cain, seeing how easily he was dealing with everyone on his own. But the reason was more likely that he didn't even know what he could do. Cain seemed like a monster to him, a psychopath. He killed people so ruthlessly without even batting an eye. Only when everyone had been killed did the men finally realize that these kids were no pushovers, and that they needed to retreat and report this to the main group. But the boss didn't want to admit this fact, and he couldn't lose to some brat, so he rushed into battle with renewed vigor. With his fury, he wanted to teach this kid a lesson. Of course, he couldn't ignore all this, because he was such an experienced fighter, and how could some kid defeat him? He didn't even have time to touch Cain before the latter stabbed him with his sword, and didn't even let him get close. The sword literally cut the unfortunate man in half. But even if he had realized the outcome of this battle, he would hardly have retreated and wanted to prove his strength. Suddenly, Leo realized that he had used the power of the wind without even realizing it. Finally, almost all of the deserting soldiers were killed, and Cain only complained that his clothes were now dirty and covered in blood. Leo was attentive and watched everything. He thought that it was not only Cain himself, but also the aura that emanated from his sword. Leo felt as if it was suppressing him, or even more. Leo felt as if this sword could cut his throat at any moment. The last survivor finally began to beg for mercy, admitting defeat and surrendering, just so he wouldn't lose his life. Cain thought about it and asked what the robber's name was. He was obedient and said his name was Urka. But now our hero was interested in whether Urha had any rope. It seems that Karen had something in mind. As a result, Karen tied his and Leo's hands together. And Leo wondered if they really had to go that far. Tying their hands was one thing. But was it really necessary to let this bandit carry their weapons? But Karen had already explained to his brother that if they wanted to be bait and find the bandit's lair, they had to be convincing. If they were in perfect order and armed, how would that look to the bandits themselves? Only then would the story of how they were captured be believable. Otherwise, it would be illogical that someone like him could carry them away, even if they were just children. Karen wasn't going to stop there, and thought about why he shouldn't get something else out of him while they were walking down the road. As it turned out, these guys were indeed deserters. Urha said that they were from the 1st Battalion, 10th Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division of the Royal Kias. Leo had a hunch that the Kingdom of Kias was on the southern front. The questions didn't end there. Corona was, of course, interested in their numbers. Urha, as far as I remember, there were only 130 of them, including the mage and 2 accompanying knights. Urha walked and answered all the questions because he had no choice. But in his mind, he thought that he had chosen the wrong ones, because initially he thought they were just worthless nobles. He remembered Karen's eyes, cold and glowing with a blue magical light. He assumed that they must be descendants of the House of Reston, the heart of the Aureus Empire. Such were his guesses. Leo continued to ask questions. If these guys had deserted, why did they need to go so far north? Urha said that their commander claimed it would help them earn enough money to live as they pleased. As it turned out later, the commander of an ordinary infantry unit had a mage. And if their goal was money, then Karen did not understand why they started robbing in the poor barony of Bellis. There were definitely some inconsistencies in Urha's story, and Karen thought about it. Well, it seemed there was no time to think, because Urki informed the guys that they had almost arrived. However, our hero decided that he would understand everything when he saw the lair with his own eyes. As they got closer to the bandit's lair, Karen and Leo tried to behave obediently, as if they were real hostages. The observer, noticing Urka, immediately asked if he had really managed to bring the hostages here. But of course they had questions about why Urha was alone and where the others had gone, and what kind of weapon he had. Urha responded rather sharply to his colleague, explaining that he had taken the weapon from these boys and now it was his trophy, so the man should back off. As for the others, they were chasing the boys' escort, and the knights were supposedly frightened and ran away. This explanation was quite plausible, and his colleagues decided to open the gate just so Urk would stop yelling, but they noticed that he was somehow nervous. But they probably assumed that his nerves were due to his joy at finally having the opportunity to earn praise from the captain. And yet the men were still indignant, saying that it would have been nice if Urha had brought the hostages earlier. But Urha didn't care about any of that. He continued to follow the script he had discussed with the boys beforehand. Urha was too weak for the robbers. Everything seemed to be going according to plan, Karen thought. But despite this, he felt a strange force and did not know how to explain it. Urcha also had a strange premonition for some reason, and he had had it for a long time. So he decided to share his thoughts with the boys. Karen and Leo began to speculate that the guillotine blade was probably reacting to this place. But what was the reason for this? Moving further into the courtyard of the lair, the guys didn't miss the strange things. The bandits had attached dead crows to the posts, securing them with nails through their wings. Apparently they had hung them up as their victims. But what was the purpose of this? Moving to a more secluded spot, Karen no longer had any doubts that it was a dark mage. Left alone together, Karen demanded that Urha untie their ropes as soon as possible and give them back their swords. The next moment, our hero turned to Leo and told him to release the sylph. Leo had no idea what his brother was talking about, but Karen insisted that she would soon be needed. And literally a moment later, the dead from that magic circle appeared before them. Karen probably expected this turn of events, but Urha, even though he was a regular here, was greatly frightened. The boss of this lair addressed the hostages, glad that they had come to him of their own accord. He mocked the guys, calling them charming little warriors, and rejoiced at such a sacrifice. As for our hero, he had always considered mages to be assholes. But now he couldn't find the dark mage anywhere. So he assumed that he was hiding somewhere and reading his spells. Karen decided to switch roles with Urka, warning the boss that if anyone moved, he would slit Urka's throat. And he also wanted to know if everything was okay with them. Leo, standing somewhere off to the side, was worried about what Karen was doing and didn't understand why his brother was taking hostages. Where had his noble honor gone? However, even the boss of this den was surprised by Karen's actions, knowing that he was a nobleman. If he was a nobleman, why did he insist that honor was above all else? Cain seemed to be hearing about this nonsense for the first time and was indignant, saying how could he not take someone hostage? The boss tensed up a little and still found the situation amusing. After all, this nobleman had miscalculated somewhere. Moreover, Urho was considered a useless hostage, and he was worthless. If Cain cut him into pieces, the boss wouldn't care. Realizing that Cain had taken the most useless hostage, Urho was so scared that he even apologized to him, because now there was nothing to manipulate. Leo noted the fact that there were far more enemies here, and he hoped that his brother had at least some kind of plan. Cain confidently replied that he did have a plan, and it was to simply eliminate the leader. The boss was still standing in the same place, looking at Cain, and was extremely surprised when he noticed the blue magic in this boy. Meanwhile, our hero asked Leo to deal with all the skeletons. Of course, the guy was surprised by such a request. Cain decided to deal with the boss of these bandits himself, because it was his job. There was no time to question Cain's decision, as the skeletons were already attacking Leo, so he was forced to deal with them, still not fully understanding what his brother had in mind. Leo had no idea how he was going to deal with all these skeletons. Cain didn't wait for the right moment and immediately attacked the leader. Our hero used the third form of his sword, creating a powerful wave that crushed the bandits. The leader probably didn't even expect the guys to break through his magical defense. Therefore, he had no way to respond to Cain. Or maybe he still didn't take Cain seriously, because for some reason he didn't even rush to run away, for example. Meanwhile, our hero managed to wound the leader, and his subordinates were no longer able to protect him. Cain understood perfectly well that if the leader hadn't been talking so much, he could have killed them. The defeated leader looked at Cain in bewilderment. Initially, he had assumed that the fortress of the Azure Sea would not have the strength to attack foreign territories, but he had miscalculated. After all, Cain's father's possessions bordered this barony. But there was no need to worry about anything now, because Cain was going to take him to the fortress alive. Meanwhile, Leo continued to fight desperately against his enemies in the form of magical skeletons, and it must be admitted that he was very good at it. The battle was not over yet, so Cain hoped that Leo would use the power of the Blue Wolf's sword and defeat them, ending the battle on his own. But the leader was struck by the fact that Cain really expected to get out of there alive. Instead of answering, our hero decided to ask the man's name. Angrily, he revealed that his name was Michael Knox. Cain responded rather rudely by thrusting his sword straight into the robber's knee, causing him to scream at the top of his lungs. But Cain did not react to this in any way, only ordering Michael to tell his men to drop their weapons. Michael quickly realized how he had earned Cain's sympathy. After that blow, he immediately ordered everyone to drop their swords. Michael obviously did not expect to be defeated by two underage boys. But when they arrived, he was sure that Cain was doomed, even if he was from the House of Reston. Cain watched his hostage closely and realized that the scoundrel was still hoping for something. His guess was that Michael was probably hoping for help from dark magicians, the magic circle in which Leo was finally disappeared. But the question arose, did Michael really think that the Reston family would actually send two brats here? Of course, two young men of noble blood were always accompanied by guards. It would have been foolish not to think of that. In any case, Michael had now taken up enough of Cain's time, and because of him, he had missed the dark mage. But a female figure had already entered the lair, holding someone's human head in her hand. Leo was happy to see his master, and Urho immediately glanced in surprise at the dark mage's head. Lady Sabina turned to Cain and Leo. They had missed the most important clue, and their mission had failed. Because of this unpleasant news, Cain kicked Michael in dissatisfaction, calling him a goat. Despite this, our hero hoped that Lady Sabina liked their strategy. However, Cain was just like Sabina's brother. He rushed at the enemy without hesitation. Therefore, Lady Sabine decided to award our hero extra points for this. After all, he behaved like a true Reston. But at the same time, she deducted points for this unworthy trick with the hostage. Lady Sabina wanted to know why Cain decided to do this, knowing the rules of the nobility. For Cain, it was simply the element of surprise. After all, it was obvious that no one expected a nobleman to take a hostage. However, Lady Sabina had to agree with this. As for Michael, he had never met anyone like Cain before. He seemed like a psychopath to him, as did everyone else in the Reston family. Now, Lady Sabina wanted to return to the Baron's castle because she had many questions for him. Michael already anticipated that it would not be easy for him, but now he remembered that everyone in the Reston family was crazy. The guards of the Reston house searched the entire bandit lair and found the hostages who were being held in a cage. There were many people of different ages among the hostages, but thanks to Karen and Leo, they were able to reunite with their families and regain their freedom. Karen, being attentive, naturally noticed Urha's reaction and thought that he was ashamed. He was not mistaken. The man admitted it himself, but it was too early for shame. Urha could end up in prison like his friends, but that was not the worst option. Karen decided that Urha should go to the fortress of the Azure Sea with Michael. Lady Sabina decided to ask Karen for advice, wondering if he might not want to tie up the bald man. However, he agreed with Lady Sabina's thoughts. They still needed someone to drag Michael to the fortress, because he couldn't walk there himself due to his wounds. But in any case, Urha should not relax. However, the man already understood that he would have to be submissive in order to survive. Suddenly, one of the former captives in the lair turned to Mr. Karen and asked if this man would also be punished. Karen replied honestly that he would be punished, because Urha was also a robber after all. But the man decided to speak up. Unlike the others, Urha had taken care of them while they were in captivity. If someone was sick, he would secretly bring them medicine, and he gave all his food to those who were hungry. Therefore, the people who had survived captivity asked for mercy for Urku. Only Karen could make this decision. Our hero quickly made up his mind and decided to show mercy. After all, it was he who had led them to the bandits' lair. Urka was actually very happy that they had decided not to punish him like the other bandits, and in his emotions, he promised to be loyal to his master until his death. While Karen and Lady Sabina were planning their next steps, Leo searched the entire lair. When he found something interesting, he decided to show it to his brother. Leo's attention was drawn to something glowing in a wooden barrel. When our hero looked inside the barrel, he immediately recognized what it was. Mana stones. Finally, when the bandits were led away from their lair, the people rejoiced and were glad that these scoundrels would finally be punished. Leo was pleased with how they had handled this task and asked Karon if Lord Rohan would throw them a feast. But Karen apparently wasn't listening to him anymore. He was lost in his thoughts, despite the huge crowd around them. Karen was initially convinced that there was another reason why such a large gang had settled in the mountains of the inconspicuous barony of Bellis. Most likely, the Baron's family did not mention it because they did not even know about the existence of a mine with mana stones on their territory. Of course, our hero could not yet judge the quality of these stones, but the mine itself could bring him enormous income. While Karen was thinking about all this, he looked rather sinister and did not even control his facial expression, which made his brother Leo nervous. Nevertheless, the young Baron decided to greet them, whom Lady Sabina had already noticed from afar. Lord Rohan was very happy to see that everyone was alive and well and had returned to him, even though he had been so worried about these boys. Lady Sabina, of course, warned the young Baron that they would take the leader of these robbers with them, and of course the one carrying Michael. Therefore, she hoped that the Baron would not object. Of course, he did not object, but he wanted to ask Lady Sabina something. Since Lady Sabina was here as a guard, the Baron had to discuss all questions with her students. Lord Rohan had prepared a small banquet, so he suggested that everyone talk over dinner. Since he wanted to return to the fortress of the Azure Sea immediately, he suggested talking now. In fact, there was no reason to delay, and Lord Rohan wanted to discuss payment for their help. Karen seemed to be waiting for him to ask about it. The barony of Bellis currently had no means to pay the fortress, so Lord Rohan wanted to ask for a delay. Karen, changing the sinister expression on his face to a confident one, revealed that he was simply curious as to why, of all places, the robbers had chosen the barony of Bellis. This barony was essentially a backwater. There was nothing special about it. Gritting his teeth, Lord Rohan endured the insult to his land, calling it a hole. Getting closer to the point, Karen explained that the robbers needed something completely different, and, in fact, he showed the mana stone. As our hero had suspected, no one in the barony could even imagine that such precious stones could be found in their lands. For this reason, our hero wanted to make a special offer to Lord Rohan. He wanted them to start joint development of the mine with the Azure Sea Fortress. Of course, this was on the condition that the fortress would provide the initial capital and security. Lord Rohan listened and wondered if this boy even understood what he was talking about. Even without considering the development costs, the storage and security expenses alone would be very high. But on the other hand, for tycoons like Reston, having a share in their mine was profitable in itself. It was not the first time Lord Rohan had seen that this youngster was not only skilled with a sword, but he did not understand where the idea to conduct such large-scale negotiations on his own initiative had come from. Of course, he would have to report this to Karen, but if everything went according to plan, it might be possible to station the Haran Knights here. After all, This could solve the problems of economic growth and territorial defense in one fell swoop. Lord Rohan sighed heavily and was ready to listen to the Duke's grandson's proposal. Cain decided that this matter no longer concerned him, and that the Lord should discuss it with his father. After all, it was too much for a child to discuss such business details. Lord Rohan was grateful for everything the boys had done for him, and warned that he would soon contact Karen's father. Our heroes were already waiting for the train. Cain decided to ask why the master had initially said that things would get complicated in the bandits' lair. When Lady Sabina spoke of this, she was referring to the dark mage with whom the master had fought. But in reality, he was not just a dark mage. It was Ted Delicad, a mage from the Dark Circle and one of the most wanted criminals in the Empire. The problem was that he was roaming the Empire with deserters from the Southern Kingdom. While Cain and Leo were busy with this trifle, they missed the most important thing. Although Cain was getting stronger by fighting powerful enemies, if he had defeated the Dark Mage, he wouldn't have had to waste time on his minions. For this reason, the mission could be considered a failure, and Cain had to learn this lesson. When Lady Sabina addressed Cain all this time, Leo felt completely out of place, but at that very moment the master called out to him. In her opinion, Leo had done better than she had expected, especially considering that this was Leo's first battle with the undead. Leo was very surprised by his master's praise, but Lady Sabina still hoped that the boy would be more confident in himself. Finally, the Lord returned to the fortress of the Azure Sea, already sensing that something had happened. There, he was told that the knight sent to the west had returned. The young masters Leo and Caron had completed their mission in the barony of Bellis and were returning with Lady Sabina. As soon as Lord Heilo heard this news, a servant rushed to him with more news. A letter had arrived from the imperial palace, which alarmed the lord. After all, the emperor had not said anything to him before he left the capital. The letter said that the emperor himself had invited Cain to the capital, which greatly surprised Mr. Heilo.